So this is a time lapse of our backyard over the past 10 years. And instead of playing background music, I thought I'd give a little commentary on nature. I think every era throughout history goes through a kind of insanity, and that maybe perhaps the insanity of modernity is our disconnect that we have with nature, which is probably most likely due to our modern disenchanted worldview. And I do think cultural and individual wholeness can only take place when we recognize that we're an integral part of nature, that we are microcosms within the macrocosm. Emerson says, "The lover of nature is he whose inward and outward senses are truly adjusted to each other, who has retained the spirit of infancy even into the era of manhood. His intercourse with heaven and earth becomes part of his daily food. In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through the man in spite of real sorrows." This reminds me of Goethe's botanical studies, where he describes that invisible archetypal something that is behind the plant, that invisible something that mathematics and reason cannot ever map out, but can only be seen through a change in perception. Goethe claimed that this was no abstract idea, but something that was actually perceivable through a participatory observation rather than a detached, objective observation. He recognized that plants were essentially a unity in process. Growth, fertilization, flowering, decay, expansion, and contraction are all symbolic expressions of that invisible something that we perceive only, as Emerson said, when our outer and inner senses are adjusted to each other. Immanuel Kant showed that the world we see is the way it is because our consciousness is the way it is. In other words, his revolutionary insight was that what we observe is grounded more in the mind or in consciousness than in the things themselves. To a large degree, we remain unconscious of the intimate link we have between nature and our own thinking. Our common sense tells us we are objective observers of nature. But for example, suppose we are observing a plant. We believe it is green. We believe we're objectively seeing a green plant, but you could say color exists only in the world of consciousness. The real plant is made up of quantum particles, and we don't have quantum eyes or quantum fingers to feel and see what that really objectively is. So the plant that we see is a representation constructed by consciousness. What we call green corresponds to an electromagnetic wave of a specific frequency and amplitude. It can be measured very easily with simple instruments, but we create the color in our mind from this wavelength. The color really belongs to consciousness rather than to the plant itself. The link between ourselves and the observed phenomena is more intimate than our common sense tells us. And this is, in fact, one of many reasons why the Romantics so strongly objected to the philosophy of the scientific Enlightenment. Isaac Newton seemed to treat color as something objectively out there in the world. But the Romantics, what their point was, is what about the aesthetics, the qualities versus the quantity, the living experience, the meaning. And if we come to believe we are only observers rather than participants, then nature, including ourselves, just becomes a disenchanted machine. So if the world we see, the objects we observe, nature herself, are in fact representations produced by consciousness, then we can do three things. One is simply experience them. Two, we can analyze, divide, and compare them, and this is a scientific method which assumes we are distinct from what we are analyzing. Or 3, we can think about the nature of these representations and how they relate to our own minds. This third way of thinking is what Owen Barfield has called beta thinking, which naturally leads to the concept of participation and the link between the observer and the observed. The scientific enlightenment that has shaped the collective consciousness of modernity is also responsible for the splintering of unity, splintering nature from thought, and thought from things, and things from speech. The Romantics raised a giant red flag, but very few listened. Even most of Western religion, which has evolved simultaneously with the Industrial Revolution over the past several hundred years, did not hesitate to follow the same epistemology as the Enlightenment. Really, for a large part, these are just two sides of the same coin. The Romantics, though, on the other hand, did not look outward at nature, searching for mathematical laws, but looked at our relationship with nature to explore the mysteries of love and desire, intuition and imagination, fear and angst, and the paradoxical nature of truth, and perhaps most importantly, to bring the unconscious into consciousness. Perhaps nature's secret cannot be seen through reducing her into the lens of a microscope, but rather through participation in her creativity. If nature consists of archetypal patterns and processes, and if we are not just observers, but rather part of nature herself, a microcosm within the macrocosm, then it is not simply reason and detached observation that leads us to truth, but rather through participation. I think if we begin thinking in terms of the primacy of consciousness rather than the primacy of matter, then we might well agree with Barfield's profound warning when he says, Barfield says, the possibility of man's avoiding self-destruction depends on his realizing before it's too late that what he let loose over Hiroshima after fiddling with its exterior for 3 centuries like a mechanical toy was the forces of his own unconscious mind. Rudolf Steiner also recommends a close observation of plants as a spiritual exercise. He says, if the attention be frequently fixed on the phenomenon of growing, blooming, and flourishing, a feeling remotely allied to the sensation of a sunrise will arise, while the phenomenon of fading and decaying will produce an experience comparable in the same way to the slow rising of the moon on the horizon. And I believe what Rudolf Steiner is saying there is that we must allow and nourish that felt change in consciousness, but not to turn them into abstract concepts, that certain feelings and thoughts are part of the participatory observation, part of seeing what eyes alone cannot see. William Wordsworth unfolds nature's secret through his poetry. He says, I held unconscious intercourse with beauty, old as creation, drinking in a pure, organic pleasure from the silver wreaths of curling mist, or from the level plain of waters colored by impending clouds. To every natural form, rock, fruit, or flower, even the loose stones that cover the highway, I gave a moral life. I saw them feel, or linked them to some feeling. The great mass lay bedded in a quickening soul, and all that I beheld respired with inward meaning. Now, it does seem to me that the mystical branches of the world's religions, which have always clashed with the more authoritarian and dogmatic branches, provide us with the best insights into nature. Many examples could be given, but I really like the following excerpt from a book called Meditations on the Tarot, A Journey into Christian Hermeticism. And I picked this quote up after the author is talking about the domination of nature and how science seeks to dominate. And so he says, imagine efforts and discoveries in the opposite direction, in the direction of construction or life. Imagine not an explosion, but rather the blossoming out of a constructive atomic bomb. It is not too difficult to imagine because each little acorn is such a constructive bomb, and the oak is only the visible result of the slow explosion or blossoming out of this bomb. Imagine it, and you will have the idea of the tree of life. The image itself of the tree comprises the negation of the technical and mechanical element. It is the living synthesis of celestial light and elements of the earth. Not only is it the synthesis of heaven and earth, it constantly synthesizes that which descends from above and that which ascends from below. Now, the ideal of Hermeticism is contrary to that of science. Instead of aspiring to power over the forces of nature by means of the destruction of matter, Hermeticism aspires to conscious participation with the constructive forces of the world on the basis of an alliance and a cordial communion with them. Science wants to compel nature to the obedience to the will of man, such as it is. Hermeticism, on the contrary, wants to purify, illuminate, and change the will and nature of man in order to bring them into harmony with the creative principle of nature and to render them capable of receiving its willingly bestowed revelation. The great work as an ideal is therefore the state of the human being who is in peace, alliance, harmony, and collaboration with life. This is the fruit of the tree of life.